Welcome to another Beefeater Fella Deep Dive. In this video, I explore the propaganda landscape in Africa. Just before we begin, I do publish detailed threads on Twitter which contain all references and sources to speed up your own research and credit sources for my research. Links to my work are in the comments. I leave comments open in case you want to reach out, and the images in this video are stock images and may not accurately reflect the information I'm talking about. Right, let's dive in. Russia and China are flooding Africa with disinformation, and the West is failing to counter this escalating warfare theatre. The proliferation of disinformation is a fundamental challenge to stable and prosperous African societies. The scope of these intentional efforts to distort the information environment for a political end is accelerating. The 189 documented disinformation campaigns in Africa by the Africa Centre for Strategic Studies are nearly quadruple the number reported in 2022. Given the opaque nature of disinformation, this figure is surely an undercount. Actors driving sophisticated disinformation attacks on African media ecosystems are taking advantage of the rapid expansion in the reach and accessibility of digital communications to reshape the continent's information systems at scales and speeds not possible through traditional analog platforms. There is a strong link between the scope of disinformation and instability. Disinformation campaigns have directly driven deadly violence, promoted and validated military coups, cowed civil society members into silence, and served as smokescreens for corruption and exploitation. This has had real-world consequences for diminishing Africans' rights, freedoms, and security. This onslaught of purposeful obfuscation comes as 300 million Africans have come onto social media in the past 7 years. There are now more than 400 million active social media users and 600 million internet users on the continent. Africans who are online rely on social media platforms for consuming news at among the highest rates in the world. Social media users in Nigeria and Kenya are near the top of the globe in the number of hours per day spent on social platforms. They are simultaneously the countries that report the most concern about false and misleading information. The major actors are Russia, China, and the Gulf states, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. In that order, ACSS Research Director Joseph Siegel said in a March 23rd interview with Voice of America. Approximately 60% of all of the documented campaigns we've identified are foreign-sponsored. They do this because it's an inexpensive but powerful asymmetric tool for gaining influence. With its goals of state capture, resource extraction, and weapons sales, Russia has a keen interest in undermining democracy and supporting military juntas. It has pushed fake news and propaganda in at least 19 African countries, according to the report. Its 80 disinformation campaigns have reached millions of users through tens of thousands of coordinated fake and sponsored web pages and social media posts. As an example of Russia's reach, two prominent disinformation influencers have a combined social media following of more than 28 million users. Their content is amplified daily by a vast network of hundreds of Russia-linked accounts and pages. It is targeted to audiences in locations strategic to Russia's interests, such as the Sahel. By shaping narratives about what's happening on the ground, this influences how the public interprets events and has direct implications for governance norms and policies, Siegel said. Many of these campaigns are aimed at propping up military juntas or authoritarian governments with whom these foreign actors have allegiances, and this enables them to assert more influence. Disinformation campaigns have targeted every region of the continent. At least 39 African countries have been the target of a specific disinformation campaign. Disinformation tends to be concentrated. Half of the countries subjected to disinformation, 20 of the 39, have been targeted 3 or more times, up from just 7 countries meeting that threshold in 2022. African countries experiencing conflict are subject to much greater levels of disinformation, facing a median of 5 campaigns, highlighting the connection between instability and disinformation. Countries confronting disinformation typically face multiple disinformation actors. At times, these actors amplify one another's misleading narratives, while at others they clash or stay in separate lanes. Nearly 60% of disinformation campaigns on the continent are foreign state-sponsored, with Russia, China, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia and Qatar as the primary sponsors. Russia continues to be the primary purveyor of disinformation in Africa, sponsoring 80 documented campaigns targeting more than 22 countries. This represents nearly 40% of all disinformation campaigns in Africa. These 80 campaigns have reached many millions of users through tens of thousands of coordinated fake pages and posts. Aggressively leveraging disinformation is a mainstay of Russia's use of irregular channels to gain influence in Africa. Russia has promulgated disinformation to undermine democracy in at least 19 African countries, contributing to the continent's backsliding on this front. African elections provide prime opportunities for disinformation. Some employ mercenary disinfo ops teams. One private Israeli group, dubbed Team Jorge, has reportedly implemented disinformation campaigns to disrupt over 20 African elections since 2015. Domestic actors have also increasingly integrated disinformation into their political playbooks, notably during Kenya's 2022 and Nigeria's 2023 election. African countries that uphold presidential term limits, those with stronger checks and balances, are less exposed to foreign-sponsored disinformation, with an average of 1.5 campaigns compared to an average of over 3 campaigns for countries without term limits. This underscores the common aim of foreign disinformation to prop up authoritarian actors. Disinformation is surging in African information spaces at a time when press freedom, a critical protective barrier against disinformation, is in decline. Legislation targeting digital disinformation has been used as a pretext for harassing and detaining journalists. Africa is subject to 23 transnational disinformation campaigns, nearly all of which are sponsored by external state actors attempting to assert influence on the continent. Russia and China are the leading sponsors of these Africa-wide campaigns to advance their geostrategic interests and shape narratives that undermine democratic processes, promote coups in Africa, stoke anti-Western and anti-United Nations sentiment, and spread confusion about climate change science, among others. Given their scale, these attacks achieve some of the most expansive reach. 2 prominent disinformation influencers connected to Russia, for example, have a combined social media following of over 28 million users, and their content has been amplified by a sprawling ecosystem of hundreds of Russian-linked accounts and pages. Russia is the single largest sponsor of Africa-wide disinformation campaigns, with 16 of these far-reaching operations. These disinformation campaigns employ paid African influencers, digital avatars, and the circulation of fake and out-of-context videos and photographs. These messages copy and paste from and are amplified through multiple channels of Russian state-controlled media, radio, and official communications, creating the repetitive echo chambers in which disinformation narratives become rote. Russian embassies appear to have helped set up a network of ostensibly African grassroots front organizations, Partenariat Alternatif Russie-Afrique pour le développement économique, or PARAID, and Groupe Panafricain pour le commerce et l'investissement, or GPCI, to generate and amplify disinformation. The Wagner Group, now rebranded as the Africa Corps, has been the Kremlin's primary vehicle for engineering disinformation in Africa, with direct links to approximately half of all Russian-linked campaigns on the continent. Following the 2023 death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, Wagner's founder, Russian disinformation operations are being absorbed into the newly established Russian Africa Corps and the Africa Initiative news agency, connected to Russian intelligence services and overseen by Artem Sergeyevich Kuryev from Moscow. The Chinese Communist Party, via the United Front and China Media Group, is the second most prolific Africa-wide sponsor of disinformation, with 5 known multi-regional campaigns. 2 of these cases have aligned with or amplified Russian narratives. The CCP's approach is more institutionalized and heavily invested in laundering official CCP narratives through the ownership and control of ICT infrastructure, as well as through licensing and training agreements with African media. These campaigns are part of a wider CCP effort to step up its use of disinformation. Russia has been the primary disinformation actor in South Africa, in addition to pushing narratives intended to polarize communities, fan distrust, and bolster the African National Congress. Russia has used influential South Africans to promote pro-Russian narratives within South Africa and abroad. China has a disinformation and propaganda playbook in Africa too, which I won't cover in this video. But briefly, China's armies of bots artificially amplifying Chinese diplomats in Africa have been most active in southern Africa, targeting 6 countries. The most documented campaigns in the region have been directed at South Africa and Zimbabwe. In both countries, external and internal actors have used disinformation to shape narratives and sow distrust among the population during presidential campaigns. China has been the primary external purveyor of disinformation in Zimbabwe. China has enacted campaigns to support ZANU-PF by suppressing opposition and civil society voices, promote Chinese political and business propaganda, and push anti-Western narratives. China has weaponized social media channels and traditional state-controlled media to disseminate and amplify false claims to support these campaigns. Consider these key points on African disinformation. Firstly, the proliferation of disinformation as a threat. The spread of disinformation has become a central threat to the stability and prosperity of African societies. This form of manipulation, while not new, has grown exponentially, as evidenced by the increase in documented disinformation campaigns, 189 in total, quadruple the number reported in 2022, according to the Africa Centre for Strategic Studies. Given the covert nature of these operations, the real extent of the problem is likely much larger. The rapid expansion of digital technologies has provided new channels for disinformation, enabling malicious actors to distribute false information at unprecedented scales and speeds. This exploitation of digital platforms such as social media, messaging apps, and other online communication tools has made traditional methods of controlling or verifying information less effective. Secondly, understand Russia and China's strategic interests. Both Russia and China have a vested interest in using disinformation as a tool of influence in Africa. Russia, for example, has employed disinformation as part of its broader hybrid warfare strategy, which includes the use of media manipulation, cyber attacks, and the exploitation of local conflicts to extend its influence in regions like Africa. This can be seen in the growing involvement of Russian paramilitary groups like the Wagner Group, as well as state-backed media operations like RT or Russia Today, targeting African audiences. China, on the other hand, while not engaging in disinformation campaigns in the same overt way as Russia, uses more subtle forms of influence through economic, diplomatic, and media partnerships. For example, through its Belt and Road Initiative and growing investments in African infrastructure, China shapes narratives that favor its political and economic agenda, often downplaying human rights abuses or promoting its model of governance. Thirdly, recognize the impact of disinformation on African societies. Disinformation undermines stability by driving violence, validating coups, silencing civil society, and obscuring corruption. In several African countries, disinformation has been linked to election-related violence, ethnic tensions, and political unrest. Military coups in particular have benefited from disinformation campaigns that present military rule as a necessary alternative to democratic governance, often exacerbating existing political instability. Beyond direct political consequences, disinformation also undermines civil society. Activists, journalists, and human rights defenders are frequently targeted, which silences dissent and diminishes the ability of these groups to hold governments accountable. This creates a vicious cycle in which corruption and exploitation go unchecked, further eroding trust in institutions. Thirdly, recognize and act on the West's failure to counter disinformation. Let's acknowledge the West's failure to counter these escalating disinformation campaigns effectively. The West, while aware of the growing threat, has struggled to respond with sufficient speed or scale. While initiatives exist to promote media literacy and fact-checking, they often lack the necessary resources, coordination, or cultural sensitivity to effectively combat the problem at the grassroots level. Western nations also face challenges in the broader information warfare landscape. While democratic governments value transparency and free speech, authoritarian regimes can easily manipulate information, making the fight against disinformation asymmetrical. Western media outlets or fact-checking organizations, meanwhile, may lack credibility or reach within certain African countries, which reduces their ability to act as a counterbalance to the influence of Russia and China. Now let's talk about a path forward and ideas to counter the spread of disinformation across Africa. The intersection of digital technologies, disinformation, and political instability in Africa is a growing concern with serious implications for governance, security, and development. Tackling this issue requires a multi-pronged approach. Firstly, strengthening local media and civil society. Empowering local media outlets and civil society organizations to fact-check and counter false narratives could help build resilience to disinformation. Secondly, building digital literacy. Increasing digital literacy across the continent, particularly among younger populations, will help people identify and reject disinformation, diminishing its impact. Thirdly, an international collaboration. The West needs to better coordinate its efforts with African governments and organizations to counter Russian and Chinese disinformation more effectively. This could include sharing intelligence, offering technical support, and fostering media independence. In summary, the disinformation landscape in Africa is complex and worsening, with Russia and China exploiting digital platforms to advance their geopolitical interests. The West's failure to adequately respond has allowed these campaigns to proliferate, fueling instability and eroding democratic progress. Addressing this issue will require sustained international cooperation and a focus on strengthening Africa's own information ecosystems. I have highlighted a stark picture of Africa's current disinformation landscape, highlighting how external actors exploit digital platforms to advance geopolitical aims and destabilize the continent. Russia leads the charge, followed by other state actors, and these efforts are concentrated in countries experiencing conflict or weak governance. Disinformation also thrives where press freedoms are declining, and it increasingly targets elections, further eroding trust in democratic processes. Countering these campaigns will require strong domestic institutions, enhanced digital literacy, and greater international cooperation to uphold the integrity of African information spaces and democratic processes. African nations with better checks and balances appear more resilient to disinformation, demonstrating that reinforcing democratic norms can help mitigate the impact of foreign influence. Please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I also leave comments open for feedback, which I really appreciate. You can view my original posts in much more detail on Twitter. Follow me at bfeeta_fella. My research threads also include full references and sources to speed up your own research. Did you know that I also provide daily updates and deep dive research videos on a range of interesting subjects, including economics, geopolitics, sanctions and sanctions circumventions, fossil fuels, rare earth elements, and much more. If you are able to support me with a coffee or subscription on Patreon, I do provide links in the description of the video. I really appreciate all the support I can get towards my research, equipment, and publication costs. Thank you. To those who have supported me on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee, you are simply awesome. Your regular support is really appreciated. Remember, folks, the YouTube edition of my Russian Telegram chat translations is released every night at midnight, UK time. Have a great day. I look forward to your next visit.